In a bold social experiment, Rihanna takes on the role of a street musician to uncover society's hidden biases and reveal how people treat those they perceive as less fortunate. But what starts as a quiet test quickly spirals into a shocking series of events that expose systemic injustice and challenge the very foundations of compassion and humanity. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The city was alive with its usual symphony of chaos. Horns honked in frustration as cars fought for dominance on congested streets. Pedestrians bustled along sidewalks, each person an individual planet in a solar system of relentless movement. Beneath this sprawling web of energy lay a quiet, dimly lit underpass, a stark contrast to the cacophony above. Its graffiti-stained walls told stories of rebellion and despair, the marks of countless hands desperate to leave behind proof of their existence. The faint echoes of footsteps reverberated through the space, mingling with the soft hum of fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. Rihanna stood at the entrance of the underpass, gripping the neck of her battered guitar case. The old instrument inside, though functional, was a far cry from the gleaming equipment she used in her concerts. Her appearance was meticulously crafted to blend into the shadows. An oversized coat hung loosely around her frame, its edges frayed from years of imaginary wear. Her hair was tucked beneath a knitted beanie that had seen better days, and her face bore subtle makeup to add lines of exhaustion and age. She looked like someone who had been forgotten by the world. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her boots scuffing against the cracked concrete. Every detail of this moment had been planned meticulously, but the reality of standing there, unrecognizable and vulnerable, felt far more daunting than she had anticipated. Her usual confidence wavered, replaced by a mix of excitement and apprehension. This wasn't just a social experiment. It was a confrontation with the raw edges of society, a world stripped of glamour and adoration. She found her spot near the wall, a section of the underpass where the light was dim enough to conceal her identity, but bright enough to illuminate her makeshift performance space. The cold from the concrete seeped into her legs as she sat down and carefully unlatched the guitar case. Inside were the tools of her trade, an old acoustic guitar with a few scratches on its body, a small stack of handwritten lyrics, and a tin cup she would use to collect change. Her fingers brushed against the strings as she tuned the instrument. The familiar action steadied her nerves. She glanced around, observing the steady flow of pedestrians. They moved with purpose, their eyes fixed ahead, as if the act of acknowledging their surroundings might shatter their fragile routines. No one paid her any mind. She was invisible. The first note she played was soft, almost timid, a whisper in the noise of the world. She began to sing, her voice weaving through the air like a thread. It was a song about hope and survival, a melody designed to tug at the heartstrings of those who stopped long enough to listen. The words came easily, but each verse carried an unspoken plea. Notice me. Notice the message beneath the music. At first, nothing happened. People continued to walk past without sparing her a second glance. A businessman in a tailored suit glanced briefly in her direction before hurrying on. A mother with a stroller veered slightly to avoid her, as if proximity alone might carry some unseen contagion. Rihanna's heart sank, but she pressed on, letting the rhythm of the music guide her through the rejection. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of a young couple. They slowed as they approached, their hands entwined. The man was tall, with sharp features and an air of disdain that seemed to precede him. His partner, a petite woman with a nervous smile, clung to his arm as if seeking reassurance. They stopped a few feet away, just far enough to suggest they didn't want to be associated with her. "Another one of these street performers," the man muttered, loud enough for Rihanna to hear. His tone dripped with condescension. "This city's turned into a dumping ground." The woman looked uncomfortable but didn't disagree. Instead, she tightened her grip on his arm and pulled him forward. "Come on, let's go," she whispered. "We're going to be late." As they walked away, Rihanna felt a surge of emotion, a cocktail of anger and sadness that threatened to break her composure. She forced herself to focus on the guitar, her fingers moving faster as the song's tempo increased. The music became an outlet for her frustration, each chord a defiant answer to the apathy around her. She had barely begun her second song when a group of teenagers entered the underpass. They were loud, their voices bouncing off the walls in bursts of laughter and crude jokes. One of them, a boy with a backwards cap and a phone in his hand, pointed at her and smirked. "Yo, check this out," he called to his friends. "We've got ourselves a superstar in the making." The others joined in, their laughter ringing out like a challenge. One of them walked closer, a tall boy with a swaggering stride. He crouched down to her level, peering at her face as if she were a zoo exhibit. "You any good?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Or you just out here begging for change?" Rihanna met his gaze but didn't respond. Instead, she played another chord, her fingers moving with deliberate precision. The boy snorted and reached for the tin cup she had placed beside her. He shook it, the coins inside jingling like tiny bells before dumping them on the ground. "Here," he said, grinning. "Thought you might want to count your fortune." The group erupted in laughter as they walked away, leaving Rihanna to gather the scattered coins. Her hands trembled as she picked them up, her vision blurring with unshed tears. This was what she had come to see. The raw cruelty that thrived in the absence of accountability. But experiencing it firsthand was more painful than she had anticipated. She straightened her back and adjusted her beanie. The song wasn't finished, and neither was she. With a steadying breath, she began to play again, her voice rising above the noise of the underpass. This time it carried a new resolve, a refusal to be silenced. The sound of the final chord faded into the din of the underpass. Rihanna sat quietly, her hands resting on the body of the guitar. Her earlier determination had wavered after the taunts and derision from the teenagers, but she refused to let their cruelty extinguish her purpose. She adjusted her posture, her back against the cool concrete wall, and began softly strumming again, this time choosing a melody that felt like a balm for her own bruised spirit. The crowd in the underpass ebbed and flowed like a tide, with new faces replacing those who had passed before. A middle-aged man in a beige trench coat threw a cursory glance her way before shaking his head and quickening his pace. A young woman with headphones barely noticed her at all. Still, Rihanna continued, her voice cutting through the apathy, even if only for herself. Her focus was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots clicking against the concrete. The sharp, deliberate rhythm of the footsteps was unmistakable. She looked up and saw a man in a security uniform striding toward her. His face was etched with irritation, his mouth set in a thin, unforgiving line. His badge gleamed under the flickering fluorescent light, catching her attention momentarily. The guard stopped in front of her and crossed his arms. His shadow loomed over her, adding an air of intimidation to his already stern presence. "You can't sit here," he said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of routine authority. "This is private property. You're loitering." Rihanna looked up at him, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm just playing music," she said calmly. "I'm not bothering anyone." The guard let out a dry laugh, his eyes narrowing. Not bothering anyone? Do you know how many complaints I've gotten today? People don't come here to watch a charity case put on a show. His words hit harder than she anticipated, but she kept her composure. I'm not asking for charity, she replied. I'm just sharing music. Save it, the guard snapped, waving his hand dismissively. Pick up your stuff and move along, or I'll have to call the cops. Rihanna hesitated, her grip tightening on the neck of her guitar. The underpass had grown quieter, the sound of their exchange drawing subtle attention. A man with a briefcase paused mid-step, his eyes flickering toward them before he decided to keep moving. A young woman with a stroller stopped momentarily but quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. I'm not breaking any laws, Rihanna said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. This is a public space. The guard's expression hardened. He took a step closer, towering over her. Listen, lady, I don't have time to argue. You either pack it up or I'll pack it up for you. Your choice. The tension was palpable. Rihanna glanced at the few people who lingered nearby, hoping for some sign of support, but their eyes avoided hers. She realized then that she was truly alone in this moment. The thought stung, but it also ignited a spark of defiance within her. She wasn't here to win anyone's favor. She was here to expose the truth. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. Her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that seemed to momentarily catch the guard off guard. You can call the police if you think it's necessary. The guard's jaw tightened. He stepped back, pulling a radio from his belt. Fine, he said tersely. Have it your way. As he spoke into the radio, Rihanna resumed her playing. The melody was softer this time, almost melancholic, as if to underscore the absurdity of the situation. Her fingers moved fluidly across the strings, her voice rising once again to fill the space. The guard glared at her but said nothing more as he barked into the radio for backup. A small crowd began to gather at a distance. It wasn't the type of audience she had hoped for. They weren't there to listen to her music, but rather to witness the unfolding conflict. A man in a dark overcoat muttered something to his companion, who shook her head in disapproval. A teenager, holding a phone, began recording, his grin suggesting he was eager to post the altercation online. Minutes later, the sound of police sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Rihanna's stomach churned, but she kept her focus on the music. She had come here to provoke a reaction, and now she was getting exactly what she'd anticipated. The guard smirked as the police cruiser pulled up to the curb just beyond the underpass. Two officers stepped out, both white men, their uniforms pristine and their expressions unreadable. They moved with practiced authority, their eyes scanning the scene before locking on to Rihanna. Is this her? One of them asked the guard, gesturing toward Rihanna with his chin. The guard nodded. Yeah, she's been loitering here all day. Refuses to leave. The officer approached Rihanna, his hands resting on his utility belt. Ma'am, you can't sit here and cause a disturbance, he said, his tone deceptively calm. We're going to have to ask you to leave. I'm not causing a disturbance, Rihanna replied evenly, meeting his gaze. I'm playing music. That's not against the law. The officer's expression darkened slightly. We've gotten complaints. You're obstructing foot traffic and making people uncomfortable. Rihanna's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Uncomfortable? I'm sitting here playing a song. If that's enough to make people uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't me. The second officer, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "Pack up your things and move on, or we'll have to take further action." Rihanna glanced at the small crowd that had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apathy. No one spoke up on her behalf. She turned back to the officers, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not leaving," she said. "You'll have to arrest me." The first officer exchanged a look with his partner, who nodded slightly. Without another word, they moved toward her. One of them grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet with more force than necessary. The other officer reached for her guitar, yanking it from her hands and tossing it carelessly to the ground. The sound of the string snapping reverberated through the underpass. "Hey," Rihanna protested, struggling against the officer's grip. "That's my property." "You should have thought about that before you decided to make a scene," the first officer retorted, his voice cold. As they cuffed her, the teenager with the phone stepped closer, capturing every moment. "Yo, this is wild," he said to no one in particular. "She's just a street performer. Why are they doing her like that?" The officers ignored him as they led Rihanna toward the cruiser. She kept her head high, refusing to let them see her falter. This was what she had prepared for: the raw, unfiltered reality of prejudice and power. The crowd began to disperse as the cruiser pulled away, leaving the underpass eerily silent. The broken guitar lay abandoned on the ground, a stark reminder of what had transpired. Inside the police car, Rihanna stared out the window, her mind racing. The experiment had taken a darker turn than she'd anticipated, but she knew this was only the beginning. The truth was ugly, and now she had the evidence to prove it. The cruiser hummed quietly as it pulled up to the station. Rihanna sat stiffly in the back seat, her wrists sore from the tightness of the cuffs. The earlier scene in the underpass played over in her mind. The guard's smirk, the officer's cold efficiency, the indifference of the onlookers. Every detail felt like a dagger in her resolve, but she reminded herself that this was the very reality she had set out to uncover. The car came to a stop. The officer in the passenger seat glanced back at her, his face devoid of empathy. "Out," he said curtly, opening the door for her. Rihanna stepped out slowly, her movements hindered by the restraints. The station loomed before her, a sterile, gray building with barred windows and a worn emblem above the entrance. The officer grabbed her arm, leading her inside with little regard for her comfort. The air was thick with the mingling scents of coffee, sweat, and bureaucracy. The desk sergeant barely looked up as the two officers approached, their captive in tow. "Loitering in a restricted area, causing a public disturbance," one of them said, placing a file on the counter. She refused to leave. The sergeant finally raised his eyes, scanning Rihanna's disheveled appearance. His gaze lingered on her face for a moment, a flicker of recognition threatening to surface before he dismissed it. "Cell 3, he muttered, waving them off. The officer holding her arm tugged her forward, guiding her through a series of narrow corridors lined with peeling paint. The cells were small and dimly lit, each one housing a few disheartened occupants who barely stirred as they passed. The metallic clang of a gate being unlocked echoed through the hallway. "In!" the officer barked, shoving her into a cell with enough force to make her stumble. Rihanna caught herself on the edge of a bench, her palms scraping against the cold metal surface. She turned to look at the officer, but he had already closed the gate, locking it with a swift motion. The sound of his boots faded as he walked away, leaving her alone in the silence. She sat down on the bench, her mind racing. The cell was claustrophobic. its walls marked with graffiti and scratches from previous occupants. A single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that danced with the flicker of her thoughts. Her stomach churned with a mix of frustration and determination. She had been prepared for confrontation, but the reality of being treated like a criminal, of being stripped of dignity and autonomy, was more jarring than she'd anticipated. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or degraded by a system that saw them as less than human. Hours passed. The distant murmur of officers talking and phones ringing served as a constant reminder of where she was. A guard occasionally walked by, glancing into her cell with mild curiosity before continuing on his way. She remained seated, her hands resting on her lap, her mind replaying every moment of the day. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the monotony. 2 officers appeared, one of them carrying a clipboard. The older of the 2 unlocked the cell, gesturing for her to stand. "Come with us," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Rihanna stood slowly, her muscles stiff from sitting for so long. She followed them down another hallway, her steps echoing in the sterile silence. They led her to an interrogation room, a small, windowless space with a single table and 2 chairs. A camera, mounted in the corner, blinked red, recording every movement. "Sit," the younger officer ordered, pulling out a chair for her. She complied, watching as the 2 men took seats opposite her. "Name?" the older officer began, his pen poised over the clipboard. "Robin," she replied, using her given name. "Robin Fenty." The officer frowned slightly, as if the name tugged at a distant memory, but he said nothing. He wrote it down, then continued. "Address?" "I don't have one," she said evenly. "I'm between places right now." The younger officer smirked. "So, you're homeless?" Rihanna met his gaze without flinching. "You could say that." The older officer sighed, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Look, we don't have time for games. Just tell us what you were doing in that underpass." "I was playing music," she said simply. "That's all." The younger officer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You expect us to believe that? No one just sits in a place like that without a reason. What were you really doing?" Rihanna tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "You tell me. What crime am I being accused of?" The room fell silent for a moment. The older officer's pen hovered over the clipboard, his brow furrowed. "Disturbing the peace," he muttered finally, "and resisting orders from law enforcement." She raised an eyebrow. "Disturbing the peace by playing music? Resisting orders by sitting on a bench?" The younger officer's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think this is some kind of game?" "No," Rihanna said quietly. "I think it's a mirror." The older officer looked up, his expression puzzled. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before she could respond, the door to the interrogation room opened. A 3rd officer entered, his expression tense. He handed a folder to the older man, whispering something that made his eyes widen slightly. The younger officer glanced between them, his impatience growing. "What is it?" he asked. The older officer opened the folder, his face darkening as he scanned its contents. He looked up at Rihanna, his demeanor suddenly more cautious. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I told you," she said, "Robin Fenty." The younger officer snatched the folder, his eyes darting over the documents inside. His face paled as he realized what they had missed. "You're kidding me," he muttered under his breath. "This has to be some kind of joke." Rihanna said nothing, her expression unreadable. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, the weight of the officer's realization pressing down like a storm cloud. "You're her," the older officer said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Rihanna." She nodded slightly, her gaze steady. "Now you understand." The room erupted into chaos. The younger officer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The older officer began flipping through the folder, muttering curses under his breath. They had treated her like a vagrant, a nobody, only to discover that she was one of the most recognizable figures in the world. "This changes everything," the younger officer said, his voice tinged with panic. "We have to—" "It changes nothing," Rihanna interrupted, her voice firm. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. And that's exactly the problem." The officers stared at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and shame. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, but Rihanna refused to let it cloud the purpose of her experiment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth. As the tension hung heavy in the air, the door opened once again. This time it was the desk sergeant, his face pale. "There's a crowd outside," he said hurriedly, "and reporters. They know she's here." Rihanna leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but resolute. "Good," she said, "let them in." The tension in the room was suffocating. The officers remained frozen in disbelief, their faces pale as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Rihanna's presence had gone from an inconvenience to a potential catastrophe for their department. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his words echoing in the room like a siren. "There's a crowd outside, and reporters." Rihanna watched their reactions with quiet detachment. Her identity, now exposed, had turned the tables. She could see the fear creeping into their expressions, the dawning realization of what their actions might cost them. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the system that had empowered them to act without question, without empathy. The older officer broke the silence first. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. "This can't be happening," he muttered, pacing the small room. "We had no idea it was her." The younger officer glanced at Rihanna, his face a mix of anger and panic. "Why didn't you just tell us who you were?" he demanded. "Why go through all of this?" Rihanna tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Would it have mattered? Would you have treated me any differently if I weren't famous?" His mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. She let the silence linger, the weight of her question filling the space between them. The sergeant cleared his throat. "We need to handle this carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If the media gets the full story before we do damage control—" Rihanna interrupted him, her tone calm but firm. "You mean before the truth gets out?" The sergeant shot her a look, his irritation barely concealed. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand perfectly," she replied. "You're worried about your reputation. But what about accountability? What about justice?" The older officer stopped pacing, his hands on his hips. "Look," he said, trying to regain control of the situation, "we made a mistake, okay? But this doesn't have to go any further. Let us fix this quietly." Rihanna's eyes narrowed. "Quietly? You think sweeping this under the rug is the solution? That's exactly why I'm here, to show how often this happens, how easily it's ignored." The younger officer leaned forward, his voice tinged with desperation. "This isn't about ignoring anything. It's about perspective. You have to see it from our side. You looked suspicious. We get complaints like this all the time, and we have to act." Act on what? Rihanna asked sharply. On assumptions? On biases? You didn't see a person playing music. You saw a threat. The sergeant stepped forward, his tone more commanding. Enough, he said. This isn't a debate. We need to de-escalate this now before it spirals out of control. But it was too late for that. The faint hum of voices outside the station had grown into a cacophony. Through the small window in the door, the glow of flashing cameras was visible, accompanied by the distant murmur of questions being shouted into the void. Rihanna stood, the movement drawing all eyes to her. She straightened her back, her presence commanding even in the drab surroundings of the interrogation room. I'm going out there, she said simply. The younger officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. You can't, he said. It'll be chaos. Let us handle it. She looked at him, her expression unwavering. You've already handled enough. The sergeant sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. Fine, he said reluctantly, but if you're going to address them, at least let us prepare a statement. No, Rihanna interrupted. This isn't about you. This is about what happened, and the world deserves to hear it exactly as it is. Before they could protest further, she moved past them, her steps purposeful and unyielding. The officers exchanged nervous glances, but made no attempt to stop her. The door opened with a creak, and the noise from outside rushed in like a tidal wave. The station lobby was packed. Journalists crowded near the entrance, their cameras trained on the door she had just stepped through. Beyond them, a crowd of onlookers had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and disbelief. Placards were already being raised, some hastily scrawled with messages of solidarity. Justice for all. Stop profiling. Music, not malice. The murmurs grew louder as Rihanna emerged, her identity unmistakable now. Whispers rippled through the crowd, blending with the rapid clicks of camera shutters. She paused at the top of the steps leading to the station's entrance, taking in the scene before her. A reporter stepped forward, her microphone extended. Miss Fenty, can you tell us what happened here today? Rihanna took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of everything she had endured. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. What happened today, she began, wasn't just about me. It was about a system that sees people not for who they are, but for what they look like. It was about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the way those biases harm the most vulnerable among us. Her words hung in the air, the crowd falling silent as they absorbed the weight of her message. I came here to see what it's like, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. To live as someone who doesn't have the privilege of fame or wealth. What I experienced was discrimination, hostility, and indifference. Not because of what I did, but because of what people assumed about me. The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder. A man in the back shouted, "We're with you, Rihanna." Others echoed his sentiment, their voices rising in a wave of support. Rihanna raised a hand, quieting them. This isn't just my story, she said. It's the story of every person who's been judged unfairly, every person who's been silenced or dismissed because they didn't fit someone's idea of who they should be, and it needs to stop. A journalist called out, "What do you hope to achieve with this experiment?" Rihanna paused, choosing her words carefully. I hope to start a conversation, she said. A real, honest conversation about accountability, about how we treat each other, and about the changes we need to make to ensure that everyone, no matter their background or appearance, is treated with dignity and respect. The applause was thunderous. The crowd's energy shifted from outrage to determination, their voices united in a chant. No justice, no peace. Behind her, the officers watched in stunned silence. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced by a growing awareness of the consequences. The older officer folded his arms, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a hint of regret. Rihanna turned back to face them, her gaze piercing. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "It's just the beginning." As she walked down the steps and into the crowd, the people parted to make way for her, their applause following her like a wave. The cameras continued to flash, capturing every moment as history unfolded before them. The officers remained inside, their world forever changed. For them, this was the beginning of a reckoning, not just for their actions, but for the system they represented. And for Rihanna, it was a step toward something greater, a chance to turn pain into progress and injustice into a call for change. The next morning, the world seemed like a different place, or at least that was how it felt to the officers inside the station. The events of the previous day had set off a wildfire. What began as a murmur of dissent in the underpass had exploded into a full-blown media frenzy, with Rihanna at the center. Her name, her words, her actions were everywhere, plastered across headlines, looping endlessly on news broadcasts, and trending on every social media platform imaginable. For the officers involved, the fallout was immediate. The younger officer, still reeling from the revelation, sat at his desk with his head in his hands. His partner stood nearby, staring at his phone screen as if it were a bomb about to go off. The sergeant, pacing behind them, barked orders into his phone in a vain attempt to contain the damage. "Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" the sergeant hissed, slamming his phone down on the desk. "We've got activists, lawyers, and half the city breathing down our necks. The mayor wants answers. The chief wants heads, and I don't even know where to start." The younger officer looked up, his face pale. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" the sergeant snapped. "Your job was to de-escalate, not to escalate. You think the world cares that you didn't know? All they see is you manhandling one of the biggest stars on the planet and tossing her in a cell like she's a common criminal." The older officer sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "She played us," he said quietly. "She knew exactly what she was doing. And she did it better than we ever could have imagined," the sergeant shot back. "Now the department's a laughingstock, and we're the poster boys for everything wrong with policing." Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd that had gathered the day before had only grown larger. Protesters held signs demanding justice and reform, their chants echoing through the streets. News vans lined the block, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters delivered live updates to their audiences. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of purpose and urgency. Inside, Rihanna sat in a conference room with her lawyer and her team. The station had begrudgingly agreed to let her use the space after it became clear that asking her to leave would only add fuel to the fire. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, was laying out the legal ramifications of the situation, but Rihanna's mind was elsewhere. She could still hear the chants outside, a rhythmic call for accountability that sent shivers down her spine. This was what she had hoped for, not the chaos, not the spectacle, but the awakening. The realization that what had happened to her wasn't an isolated incident, but a reflection of a system that desperately needed change. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, which was filled with notifications. Texts from friends, calls from journalists, tweets and comments from fans around the world. Among them were messages of support, gratitude, and solidarity, but also anger, confusion, and even threats. The divide was stark, and it only strengthened her resolve. Her lawyer cleared her throat, drawing Rihanna's attention back to the room. "This is a pivotal moment," she said. "You have the public's ear. Whatever you say next will shape the narrative. We need to be strategic." Rihanna nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "I don't want strategy," she said. "I want honesty." Her lawyer frowned. "Honesty is important, but so is framing. The department is already working on a counter-narrative. They'll say it was a misunderstanding, that the officers were acting in good faith. If you're not careful, they'll paint you as the one in the wrong." "Let them try," Rihanna replied. "This isn't about me. It's about what they did and what they represent. The truth doesn't need framing. It just needs to be heard." The lawyer hesitated, then nodded. "All right," she said, "but be prepared for pushback. This is going to get messy." Later that day, Rihanna stepped outside the station to address the crowd. The moment she appeared, the chants grew louder, the applause erupting like a wave. She raised her hand for silence, and the crowd quickly obliged. Cameras zoomed in, microphones were thrust forward, and all eyes were on her. "Yesterday," she began, her voice carrying over the sea of faces, "I sat in an underpass, playing music. I didn't ask for money. I didn't block anyone's path. I was just there. But for some people, my presence alone was enough to make them uncomfortable, enough to call security, enough to call the police." She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd was silent, their attention rapt. "I wasn't arrested because I broke the law," she continued. "I was arrested because of what I looked like, because of what they assumed about me. And I know I'm not the only one. I'm standing here today because I can stand here, because I have a platform. But what about the people who don't? What happens to them when no one's watching?" Her voice cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through despite her efforts to remain composed. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about all of us. It's about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other, and the way we allow systems of power to dehumanize the people they're supposed to serve." The applause that followed was thunderous. Reporters shouted questions, but Rihanna ignored them, turning instead to the protesters who stood behind her. Their faces were a mix of determination and hope, their signs held high. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do, but I believe we can do it, together." As she stepped back inside, the energy outside remained palpable. The chants continued, the crowd refusing to disperse even as the sun began to set. Inside the station, the officers watched in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. For the younger officer, the day had been a wake-up call. He replayed the events in his mind, questioning every decision he had made. For the older officer, it was a moment of reckoning, a realization that the system he had upheld for so long was far from infallible. And, for Rihanna, it was a turning point. The experiment had begun as a way to expose the truth, but it had become something much bigger. It was a call to action, a demand for change, and a reminder that even in the face of injustice, the power of the people could not be silenced. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long shadows across the streets, the energy outside the station refused to wane. Protesters remained steadfast, their chants filling the air with a rhythmic call for justice. News crews continued to broadcast live updates, their cameras capturing every angle of the historic moment. Social media was ablaze, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #Rihanna Experiment dominating trends worldwide. Inside the station, the tension was palpable. The officers who had been directly involved in the incident huddled together in a corner, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. The sergeant paced the floor, his phone glued to his ear as he tried to navigate the political and legal fallout. The younger officer leaned against a wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, defensiveness, guilt, and an unshakable sense of unease. He replayed the events of the past 24 hours over and over, searching for a way to justify his actions. But each time he came up short. "What do we do now?" he finally asked, breaking the silence between him and his partner. The older officer sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "We wait," he said, "and hope this blows over." "It's not going to blow over," the younger officer muttered. "Not this time." Meanwhile, in a private room elsewhere in the station, Rihanna sat with her lawyer and a representative from the mayor's office. The room was stark and utilitarian, with a single table and a few chairs. Papers were spread out across the surface, each one detailing the legal and political ramifications of the situation. The mayor's representative, a sharp-dressed man in his early 40s, adjusted his tie nervously. "Miss Fenty," he began, "on behalf of the city, I want to apologize for what happened to you. This incident does not reflect the values we strive to uphold." Rihanna raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Doesn't it?" she asked. Her tone was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like this is exactly what your system was built to do." The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We understand your concerns," he said, "and we're committed to making changes to ensure something like this doesn't happen again." Her lawyer leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "What specific changes are you proposing?" she asked. "Because vague promises aren't going to cut it. We need concrete action." The representative cleared his throat, fumbling with his notes. "We're reviewing the actions of the officers involved," he said. "Disciplinary measures are being considered, and we're looking into ways to improve training to address implicit bias." Rihanna exchanged a glance with her lawyer, who gave her a subtle nod. "That's a start," she said, "but it's not enough. This isn't just about a few bad officers. It's about the entire culture of policing, the way people in power treat those they think are powerless. That's what needs to change." The representative nodded slowly, his discomfort evident. "We're open to discussions on broader reforms," he said carefully. "Your voice will be an important part of that conversation." Later that evening, the station released a public statement acknowledging the incident and pledging to investigate the officers' actions. The statement was met with mixed reactions. Some praised the department for taking responsibility, while others criticized it as an empty gesture. For many, it was too little, too late. In the days that followed, the fallout from the experiment continued to ripple across the city and beyond. The younger officer and his partner were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The security guard who had initially called the police was quietly dismissed from his position, but for the protesters and activists who had rallied around Rihanna's cause, these actions were only the beginning. Rihanna, meanwhile, found herself thrust into an unexpected role as a spokesperson for justice and reform. She held a press conference a week after the incident, standing before a crowd of reporters, activists, and supporters in the heart of the city. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her voice steady and resolute. It's about the countless people who face this kind of treatment every day. People whose stories don't make the news, whose voices aren't heard. We can't let this continue. We have to demand better, from our leaders, from our institutions, and from ourselves. Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of activism that spread far beyond the city. Community organizations and advocacy groups use the momentum to push for broader reforms, from increased accountability in policing to better resources for marginalized communities. One of the most poignant moments came when Rihanna visited the underpass where the experiment had begun. The space, once a forgotten corner of the city, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Artists had painted murals on the walls, transforming the once drab concrete into a vibrant tapestry of colors and messages. Among them was a portrait of Rihanna herself, her face framed by lyrics from the song she had played that day. "Your voice matters, even when no one's listening." She stood before the mural, her hands in her pockets as a small group of musicians gathered around her. One of them, a young woman with a violin, stepped forward hesitantly. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling, "for standing up for all of us." Rihanna smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not just me," she said. "It's all of us, together." In the weeks and months that followed, the experiment became a turning point in the fight for social justice. The video footage of the incident, coupled with Rihanna's unwavering determination, inspired a global conversation about bias, power, and humanity. People from all walks of life shared their own stories, creating a tapestry of voices that refused to be ignored. For Rihanna, the experience was both humbling and empowering. She had stepped into the shadows to reveal the truth, and in doing so, had become a beacon of light for others. But she knew the journey was far from over. "This is just the beginning," she said during a televised interview. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens because people demand it, because they refuse to settle for anything less. And I refused to settle." Her words became a rallying cry, echoing across cities, towns, and communities around the world. And as the movement grew, so did the hope that a better, more just world was not only possible, but inevitable. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and eye-opening experiments. Share this video with your friends and family to keep the conversation going. And be sure to check out our other videos. You won't want to miss what's coming next.